The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media Incorporated or its assigns.
Thank you for joining us on Farm Connections. I am Dan Hoffman, and I'm pleased to introduce our panel tonight. On my right, Dr. Repnicki, Dr. Bennett, Dr. Strobel, and Doug Johnson from, Doug Peterson from Minnesota Farmers Union.
Thank you.
And the topic tonight for our panel is animal welfare and the use of antibiotics. And I took a little time to go slowly on that because possibly our audience might have a flashpoint on that. Maybe have some thoughts on animal welfare and antibiotics, but would you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice, and then we'll begin to talk about that topic.
Okay, I'll go first
Perfect.
since I'm first in line. I'm a dairy faculty member at the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Minnesota, and I'm the immediate past president of the Minnesota Veterinary Medical Association, which is the state professional organization for veterinarians in the state. We have close to 2,000 members in that organization.
Thank you. Dr. Bennett?
Hi, I'm Jim Bennett. I work for Northern Valley Dairy Production Medicine Center in Plainview, Minnesota. I live near Rochester, Minnesota. And I've worked in this practice for 30 years now, and currently I work almost entirely on cows and mostly on dairy cows.
Thank you.
I'm Mike Strobel. I'm a veterinarian in Northfield, Minnesota. Our veterinary clinic is Cannon Valley Veterinary Clinic. I currently work on mostly swine, although I've worked on dairy and a variety of other species over the years. I've been in practice for 28 years.
Doug?
Doug Peterson, I'm president of the Minnesota Farmers Union. That's 11,000 member organization. We deal in public policy, we create co-ops, and we educate public and consumers and farmers about issues. Some of my background, I spent 12 years in the legislature, farmer from western Minnesota, and also an auctioneer and former teacher.
We have a lot of experience and a lot of good knowledge tonight, so we're going to use it well. When we think about animal welfare, what does that mean to you?
It's interesting. I mean, this panel has a breadth of experience within production animal agriculture, but what's really interesting today is what does that term mean to the end consumer of our dairy and our pork products? At the CHS Miracle Birth Center at the Great Minnesota Get-Together at the State Fair, the Miracle Birth Center is one of the most popular exhibits at the fair. And I think one of the reasons for that is as we have more and more people that aren't from farm backgrounds, they have lots of questions about where does our food come from? And how do we know that our animals are well taken care of before we consume them, whether it's in the form of milk or in meat animal production? So I think animal welfare, we have a definition and we're professionals involved in that industry, but what's really interesting is for us to think about how do we communicate that effectively to people that just want to know how do farmers take care of their animals.
And if a consumer has the question about animal welfare and they look at it and say, I don't believe veterinarians and farmers are taking good care of animals or they're abusing them, how do you show them differently?
Well, as a professor at the university, one of the things we try and do is train our new graduate veterinarians to be able to work with clients, okay, to ensure the welfare of the animals. But I think I'm going to defer that to our two practitioners here and let them kind of answer, how do they work with their clients, in day-to-day practice to ensure the well-being of their animals.
Perfect, thank you.
Well, let me say first, I think animal welfare, its a definition for most people, it's really just taking care of animals. And that could be a pet, could be a horse, could be a dog, a cow, whatever. And it's looking out for the welfare of that animal. And I think if we distill it down to something that simple, people can understand that farmers are people. They're no different in that way than pet owners, horse owners, and they care for their animals, just like people care for their dogs. So, when people see something on TV, a case of animal abuse, it's clear animal abuse, and then they think, oh my goodness, farmers don't take care of their animals. It's like seeing someone abusing a dog and saying, well, I guess dog owners don't take care of their animals. And I think people have people sometimes make that assumption because they don't know anything or know much about agriculture. They know about taking care of a dog, and they know that their neighbor takes care of the dog because they've been there. They've been to the house and they see people taking their dogs for walks or taking them to the veterinarian. But they don't know anything about farms. And so they immediately are less likely to think, oh yeah, I know the farmer, I've been there, he takes care of his cows. And so fundamentally, it's no different, and people have to understand that farmers are people. There will be abuse on farms. There will always be abuse, just like there will be abuse of dogs, cats, humans, because we are people and we are fallible. But farmers are like everyone else, and they are concerned about animal welfare. They care for their animals.
Dr. Strobel, you work largely with pork.
With swine, yeah. And the swine business is very similar to the dairy business or taking care of your dog at home every night. Our producers very much care about their animals on the whole. Certainly there are examples of producers or employees of producers that may not do their job right every day. But that doesn't mean the whole industry is bad because one employee does something bad one day. We have a program in the swine industry called PQA+, which is actually designed to train and teach both the employees and owners of our animals how to take better care of their animals and how to assure their welfare on a day in and day out basis. And it's actually being driven not only from the farm end but also from the consumer end as a way to assure that we have good quality production systems in place that are going to assure the safety and health of our animals every day.
Dr. Strobel, thanks for mentioning that. I did bring in a PQA+ notebook, and the wealth of materials that the pork producers put together is financed by the producer themselves through checkoff dollars.
That's correct.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars.
It's really a proactive way on the part of producers and in conjunction with the veterinary community to develop a program that addresses not only the needs of the animal but also the needs of how to treat the animal, for example, with antibiotics, how to use them appropriately, how to have a correct relationship with the veterinary professionals that oversee a lot of this stuff, and we help them to do a better job every day. And it kind of dictates it and tries to standardize it across a very large industry in the United States so that it's being done the same in Minnesota and Iowa and Ohio and everywhere that pigs are raised. And it's been a very good program, and there's something very similar to it on the dairy side and the beef side and so forth. So we were light years ahead of what we were 10, 15, 20 years ago in the course of our practice life. And we've seen steady improvement in terms of the welfare and health of the animals that we care for.
With this program, how can consumers be comfortable that it's helpful and producing animals have been well taken care of? How is that monitored?
A variety of ways. As veterinarians, we're actually go out and inspect and train our customers on a regular basis based under the PQA+ program. It's dictated that the employees or the owners of these programs go through this training a minimum of once every 3 years. The most recent version actually requires us to go out to and what we call a kind of an audit of the farm to look at how they're doing things for a full day. We'll go out there, we'll measure the ventilation systems, make sure that the air is healthy, that the water is clean, that the feed is available, that there's not too many pigs in a pen, there's not so much crowding, that they're appropriately taking care of sick animals, all the different things that are involved in raising animals responsibly. And we do that on a one-on-one basis with the individuals that are actually taking care of the animals every day. That has been an extremely good program, and it's been good not only from the veterinary perspective, but it's also been good from the producer perspective because they're learning how to do things better. And we're seeing steady improvement in how we raise and take care of our animals.
So you look at this program here that the pork industry has put together. The dairy industry is launching this year, actually they launched it last year, is a National Dairy Farm Program, FARM. And what FARM stands for is Farmers Assuring Responsible Management. And it has the same type of thing. This is really just written documentation of what farmers have done for literally hundreds of years. And this is just written documentation because as our farms have gotten bigger, okay, there's more employees, and so training programs become really important. And there's also this documentation that's that validation to outside people, say, do you do what you say you do? And these programs are allowing the industry to be able to do that with the consumers.
These programs were actually largely designed initially to satisfy the export markets, the people we sell to outside of the United States, as a way to assure that we had a level of quality in our meat and milk supplies that met their standards. The outgrowth of it, however, is that it's actually improved the general care and keeping of animals in the United States significantly over the last 20 years. And I would tell you that my practice life, which has been 28 years, I have seen that what we're doing today is far better than what we were doing 28 years ago. And we have this stereotypical picture of what a family farm is, which is something probably out of the 60s or even the 50s, which may not be true today, but the care and feeding and how we deal with our livestock today is better than it's ever been probably in the history of the United States. And so I think it's something that the general public should be very proud of, the fact that we're doing a better and better and better job. And as veterinarians, we're a big part of that. We spend all of our time trying to figure out better ways to take care of our animals, to help keep them healthier, help be more productive, help use less resources and environmental things. And we do that. That's our job. That's why we come to work every day.
Do you need to be certified through this program to monitor our farms?
That is correct. We go through each of the veterinarians that do this in training. It's not just veterinarians, it's also extension, agricultural extension people and other allied industry people go through an extensive training program. It's a whole day long program where we go through every single thing, deal with real life situations, how we would handle it, learn how to go out and audit the farms and perform the services that were promised in this organization. And then we go out and in turn pass that information on to the people that are actually dealing with the animals every day.
Great. According to National Pork Producers in Des Moines, 50,000 producers have been trained in this already.
Yep, and we've seen even just getting on the farm and spending that time with the employee in many cases is highly valuable, and we find that we improve the situation for the animals almost every time. Because there may be things, little things, it's not big things, it's not like they're abusing the animals or something, but there are little things that you can do better in any industry that you deal with. And whether you go into a job in downtown Minneapolis or you're out on a farm, you need to do things consistently and right every day, and that's part of doing a good job. And PQA Plus has helped our farmers do a better job.
Dr. Strobel, if a farmer doesn't do this program, are there consequences?
Actually, there are. Currently, if you are not PQA Plus certified within the last 3 years, you can't actually, most packing plants will not accept your livestock. So you can't sell your animals to market. So there's very severe consequences of not doing it.
Huge consequence, thank you.
There's also the information in there is so good. A big component of both the swine quality assurance and also the dairy quality assurance is how drugs and medicines are used on our farming operations. And I know that's the other component of this, is how do we tie in responsible antibiotic use on our farms. The record keeping systems in there are very extensive, and it's excellent training programs. So the cost is maybe loss of market access because you haven't done it, but the cost of not doing this as a producer is to not know the things you're supposed to do to prevent drug residues in a food product. And there's both milk and meat is highly scrutinized within this country for absence of contaminants and residues. Okay, so there's a cost to the producer if they ship a contaminated product. And so they don't want to do that, and so that's a reason to go through these training programs.
What happens with a hot product, and maybe you can define for the audience, what's hot product?
Hot product. So on the dairy side, every tanker load of milk that comes to a processing plant is required to be tested for antibiotics. Okay, that's been that way since the late 1980s. Okay, and so the milk that goes into the food supply has been very closely monitored, looking for any drug residues. If that tanker tests positive, then each individual farm that contributed to that tanker load, there was a sample taken at the time of pickup from the dairy. The individual samples are then tested, and they will find out which farmer actually shipped antibiotic contaminated milk. That producer now is responsible for the entire cost of that load. That milk is disposed of, so it doesn't enter the food supply, and the producer is required to go through both some education, and there's some penalties involved in order to get their permit back for having shipped a positive tanker load. So,
the question I have for Paul is, does every farmer, and I think I know the answer, but I'm going to draw it out of a professional, does every farmer use antibiotics all the time on an animal? Is there a difference between therapeutic and sub-therapeutic types of programs within animal meat production, whether it's in swine or dairy? There's huge policy implications that are coming at us in the legislature and also in the Congress. And just an explanation of, you talk about the hot product, and you also talk about the welfare of using the correct medicines, like you would take care of a sickness that you may have. So if you could help me with that.
So from a product standpoint, from a food safety standpoint, all production systems are under the same regulatory umbrella. There's a federal document called the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, okay, that dictates the type of quality and safety testing that needs to go into our products. Not only do we screen for potential presence of drug residues, we also look for total bacteria counts and a number of other items that are identified as food safety items. So every farm has to comply to that. So all our milk is tested and screened for and monitored the same way. It's difficult to say with one broad stroke of a brush that all farmers do anything, because the nice thing about farming in this country, it's farmers are innovative, they got their own production systems. Some people want to have a large farm, some families have a small farm, some people want to have an organic production system. All those types of production systems can exist in this country when they can find markets for their products. From a regulatory and from a food safety standpoint, they're all screened for exactly the same way.
Doug, I think you do a lot of work in government policy. You work with producers in Minnesota. What are the hot topics? What are consumers and what are producers of food, maybe even at battle about?
Well, consumer, the battle, and the frustration for a farmer is that consumer that's buying your food, number one, it's cheap and it's safe and all of those things. Farm people know that. Consumers don't necessarily know how that production model is, and if there is a story on the nightly news or whatever the case might be that may look at a bad actor, then everybody's painted with the same brush. That's the policy piece that we're confronted with all the time, and when policy makers, and I call them our city cousins or suburban friends, don't quite understand farming. And that's not to say that they're to dish them anyway, but they don't make their living at it. But how do you make that communication between that person at the supermarket and that farmer and the health and well-being of the family and the health and well-being of the farmer? And the other part of that is there is a certain amount of question about antibiotics, and you can't deny that in this industry. There's a certain amount of question about how animals are taken care of as far as confinement. That's another policy piece. It's coming at us in Minnesota. It's already in California and Florida with crates and those kinds of things. Our policy piece there for Farmers Union is to make sure that farmers and consumers are understood, first of all, but at the same time, you still have to be able to farm in what I call a traditional method of animal husbandry that produces that final product for a consumer, whether it's meat or it's a vegetable fiber, or I don't care what it is. There's still a certain amount of safety regulations that you got to go through. But some people believe what farmers are doing isn't correct. And you guys as veterinarians, you've seen abuses, you've seen good practices on the issue of the niche farming with the organic, on the antibiotics, which you just explained. That's the policy piece we continually struggle with. Will our city cousins who are in the legislature with their constituents have the faith that what we're doing as farmers will produce a healthy food? That is...
Our state veterinary association spends a lot of time up at the Capitol being a resource for our legislators to help them understand here's the role that the necessary and legally required role for veterinarians to be involved with how drugs are used on the farm. Most of the drugs that farmers use are prescription, so they do require veterinary authorization for that. In order for a veterinarian to do that, there has to exist what's known in the law as a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. Okay, so the patient is the food animal, the client is the producer, and then the veterinarian's involved. In order to have that veterinary client-patient relationship, the veterinarian has agreed to take on the responsibility to oversee how drugs are used on that farm, and the producers agreed to follow the direction of the veterinarian. The second piece is the veterinarian has to be on that farm and be aware of the production practices to know when drug treatments are medically necessary, and there's some oversight into how those drug treatments are done. And the third component is the veterinarian is readily available in case that there's adverse reactions. Okay, so we explain that to the legislator that the system is in place to help ensure the safety of the food, and it's there in place to ensure the welfare of the animals, because these guys can talk about a little bit. There are conditions that we have, the antibiotic use is therapeutic, to treat diseases that animals get. And when you treat an animal and you make it healthy again, it grows better, it's healthier. Okay, so Mike, you can talk. We were talking at the preliminaries about the confusion between growth-promoting antibiotics and using therapeutic antibiotics.
In reality, in our systems today, we're generally treating disease with antibiotics. We're not using antibiotics in the strictest sense for growth promotion. Now, the net effect of treating disease is animals do better. They grow faster, they get to market quicker, they're more economically viable from a farmer's perspective. But the use of the antibiotics themselves is primary for treating disease. And now we may put antibiotics in the feed, or we may put antibiotics in the water, or we may give them a shot, just like we do in humans. But at the end of the day, what we're ultimately doing is treating a respiratory infection, or a diarrhea, for example, or some other infection, an abscess. And just like we do in people, and we don't misuse antibiotics. We really try to limit the use of antibiotics in our systems because it costs money every time you put an antibiotic into an animal. But we have to use them appropriately, so we treat those diseases and cure the animal, hopefully, so they go on and be productive.
Dr. Strobel and Dr. Bennett, how do we answer the consumer's question of, should I be concerned about antibiotic use? How does it affect my food? And is there resistance being built up that will affect humans?
That's a tough question.
It's a difficult
It's a complicated
That's
question.
really the question that a lot of people want to know.
It is a complicated question, and I don't think there's a simple answer to it. I can tell you from historically that there hasn't been a lot of change in the resistance patterns of the bacteria that we see in animal agriculture over the last 30 years that we've been around in practice. Diagnostic labs that are in Minnesota and a variety of the Midwest states that deal with animal pathogen submissions that we do as veterinarians, we send in samples all the time when we have sick animals, have shown that there's very little drift in terms of how the different antibiotics work on the various organisms that we typically see in our farms over a long period of time. So I take that as a bit of comfort in thinking that we're not creating this big superbug that's going to kill everybody off. A lot of the resistance problems that the human population sees that relates to the human population, quite frankly, comes from things that are being done in the human population. I think any physician would tell you that the most likely place to cause resistant organisms that affect people is probably in a hospital setting, because you have lots of sick people in that setting that are bringing these organisms in. They're being treated with lots of antibiotics over a long period of time, and you're in a debilitated position when you walk in the door. Whereas in animals, typically we are dealing with finished products that are treated in some way. In the case of milk, we pasteurize it to kill most of the organisms that are in place. In the case of meat, most of it is cooked at high temperature, which again, if there is any contamination on it, which in most cases there's not, you have the opportunity to kill it. And we talk about things like salmonella in chickens, which is a fairly common contaminant in chickens just because it's a common thing in chickens. But yet if the consumer takes and handles the product correctly and cooks it correctly, you're not going to ever be exposed to salmonella. So irregardless of whether that bacteria was resistant to something or not, the consumer never experiences it because they never get exposed to it in the first place. So there's lots of links in the chain between the time of the farmer on the farm and the ultimate consumer that try to assure food safety all the way along the line. Whether it's radiating pork or hamburger to reduce E. coli chances, packaging and modern packaging lines in the packing plants, which take great pains to try to eliminate any contamination on the animal after it's slaughtered. So you have all kinds of safety mechanisms in place, and then you've got all the testing that goes on in addition to that in every step of the chain. You've got antibiotic testing, you've got testing for pathogens that might be on the carcass, for example, after it's slaughtered. So you've got all these things that are going on that are adding additional levels of protection for the consumer. And the net result is we have a very safe food supply in this country, probably the safest in the world. And as a consumer, I'm not very worried about eating pork today. It's a lot safer today than it was 50 years ago because we didn't have all these things that we have today.
Thank you. Dr. Bennett, dairy?
Yeah, let me talk about dairy a little bit. I think sometimes the public has a perception that farmers are walking down like a wide earth with antibiotic syringes in each hand injecting their animals. And a couple things. First of all, as I said before, farmers care about their cows. They don't want to do that. Secondly, dairy cows produce milk. We sell their milk, and as Paul said, we can't have antibiotics in their milk. And there's a big disincentive to give antibiotics because, with rare exception, if you give a dairy cow antibiotics, you can't sell her milk, which is why you have a dairy cow. So farmers don't do that, they don't do it lightly. Secondly, antibiotics are expensive. And third, when they do that, they have to pull that cow out of production. She's got to be somewhere else, or she's got to be identified. So they don't want to do that. Am I worried? No, I'm not the least bit worried about antibiotics use in agriculture. As far as eating food, I would also say there's a perception that most antibiotics are used in agriculture and that we use way more antibiotics than we should. But if you look at it on a per pound basis, the usage per pound of antibiotics in agriculture really isn't much different than it is in the human population. So if you believe all animals are running around getting injected with antibiotics, well, I guess all people are running around getting injected with antibiotics. It's not true. The larger question about antibiotic resistance, I think, is a fair question, and I think agriculture has to be at the table in that discussion. And I think our physician colleagues need to be at the table in that discussion.
And agriculture is very concerned about
yes,
that too,
absolutely.
as equally as the consumers are. Agriculture is concerned.
Right. We have to be concerned about that, and we have to be concerned about what impacts that we may have on that issue, because it's a potentially an emerging problem. But to blame it on agriculture, as Mike said, and not talk about antibiotic usage in people, really, I think is putting the cart ahead of the horse.
I want to follow up a little bit on what Dr. Bennett said about this reluctance of producers to treat their cows. It's like, yeah, there's reluctance because we have to handle those animals differently, but there's also an acceptance that these medicines have been evaluated by the FDA, they're approved for specific diseases and conditions, and they're very effective in the diseases that they treat. So we can return that animal to health much more efficiently when we have access to all the technology that's available. So even though the producer maybe doesn't want to withhold that cow's milk from the tank, because we realize it's in our best interest because it's in the best interest of the cow.
Excellent. And great answers.
Yep.
And Doug, I'm sorry, we've only got about 10 seconds.
Oh, okay.
Any closing comments real quick?
Well, there's one last thing, and that is in animal agriculture, the majority of the antibiotics that we use are old. We don't use the newest and the best thing that's available on the human side. Typically, we're running 10, 15, 20 years behind the human side in terms of what we're using on a routine basis.
And are you saying well tested and tried?
These products are things that are developed in 1930 we're using today as penicillin. It's been around for 70 years, so we're not using the newest and the best.
Gentlemen, you're passionate, knowledgeable. We're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Repnicki, Dr. Bennett, Dr. Strobel, and Doug Peterson. Thank you so much. For more information, log on to ksmq.org and click on Farm Connections. There you'll find past episodes and participate with blogs where you can submit your ideas and questions. Tune in next time as we discuss the impacts of ag on all of us. From everyone at Farm Connections, I'm Dan Hoffman. Please join us next week. Thank you.